endangered species and their habitats. So developers might need to go through an environmental review with ODNR, providing all sorts of details about the project and how it might affect the local ecosystems.
And it's probably best to get ODNR involved early on, right? Avoid any potential roadblocks down the line.
Exactly. And then there's also the Ohio Housing Finance Agency, or OHFA. If a developer is seeking funding from them, OHFA has its own set of environmental standards that need to be met. And don't forget, the Ohio EPA has different divisions for air, water, and waste management too. So depending on the specifics of the development, permits might be needed in those areas as well, like, say, for managing stormwater runoff during construction.
So it's a pretty multifaceted process on the environmental front, lots of different agencies and regulations to navigate.
It is, but it's all ultimately about ensuring that new development happens in a way that's sustainable and protects the environment.
Okay, so we've cleared the zoning hurdles, we've got our plans approved, we've addressed all the environmental concerns. It seems like we're finally ready to talk about getting the actual electricity to these future homes. And in Dayton, that means working with AES Ohio.
Exactly. AES Ohio, formerly known as Dayton Power and Light, is the primary electric utility in the Dayton area. They have a long history in the region, and building a good relationship with them early on is absolutely essential for developers.
So what's the first step in working with AES Ohio?
One of the first things developers typically do is contact AES Ohio's Construction Control Center to get something called an Electrical Service Information Form, or ESIF. This form basically kicks off the formal process of coordinating the new development's electrical service.
So the developer fills out the ESIF, and then AES Ohio sends out a crew to start stringing wires.
Well, it's a little more involved than that. AES Ohio will work closely with the developer to figure out the best way to connect the new development to the grid. They'll also take care of setting up temporary electrical service during the construction phase so the builders can power their tools and equipment.
Makes sense. You can't exactly build houses in the dark.
Definitely not. And before AES Ohio will actually turn on the power to any of the new homes, they require a thorough inspection of all the electrical work to make sure it meets all the safety codes.
I imagine that's pretty important. We'll get into those codes in a bit, but before we do, I wanted to ask about something I came across in our research. AES Ohio is involved in some kind of market-based auction for electricity generation, right? How does that fit into the whole picture?
Yeah, that's basically how AES Ohio obtains the electricity they distribute to their customers. It's a market mechanism that ultimately affects the price everyone pays for power. And on a separate note, AES Ohio has also been investing a lot in smart grid technology across the Miami Valley. This is basically a modernization of the electrical grid, which can lead to a more reliable and efficient power system.
So those new developments could actually benefit from that investment in smart grid technology.
They could. And then there's the whole matter of digging, which is obviously a big part of installing new power lines. I'm sure there's some pretty strict rules around that.
Oh, absolutely. I've heard of that 811 number.
Exactly. Before any digging starts, whether it's for the power lines themselves or anything else, anyone doing excavation work has to call 811, which is the Ohio Utility Protection Service. This notifies all the utility companies in the area to come out and mark the locations of their underground lines.
So it's not just about electricity, it's gas, water, telecommunications, everything.
Right. It's a critical safety measure to prevent accidental damage, which can be dangerous and incredibly expensive to fix. And for developers who need to coordinate anything with AES Ohio throughout this process, their Construction Control Center is the main point of contact.
Okay, so we've got the power company on board, we know where to dig. Now we're actually ready to start building the physical infrastructure to get that electricity to the houses. And one of the big choices developers have to make is whether to go with overhead power lines or bury them underground. What are the main pros and cons of each approach?
That's a huge decision with both immediate and long-term consequences. Let's start with overhead lines. The biggest advantage is cost. They're simply cheaper and easier to install. And if there's ever a problem, like a fault in the line, it's usually pretty easy to find and fix.
But they're not exactly the prettiest things to look at, and they're pretty vulnerable to the weather, right? Trees falling on them, ice storms, that sort of thing.
Yeah, they're definitely more susceptible to damage from weather, trees, even accidents. And that can lead to more power outages, which nobody wants.
Yeah.
And then there's the ongoing maintenance. The utility company has to regularly trim trees around those lines to prevent them from causing problems.
Okay, what about underground lines? I know they're more expensive, but they seem to be getting more popular, especially in newer developments.
Yeah, for good reason. First off, they're just more aesthetically pleasing. You don't have those poles and wires cluttering up the landscape. And some studies suggest that